Welcome to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership, where you'll hear insights and useful strategies, as well as lessons learned from other nonprofit leaders and valuable tips from a variety of experts. Here to help you with the challenges and opportunities you face day after day is your host and nonprofit leadership expert, Sarah Olivieri.
Hello, nonprofit leaders, and welcome to your go-to place for information and inspiration to help you be even more effective. I'm your host, Sarah Olivieri, and you're listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. My guest for this episode is Sally Loftis. She's a consultant specializing in human resources, organization development, and social justice. She has made significant contributions in the realm of pay equity, which we're going to be talking about today. She completed her Master's of Science in Organization Development at Pepperdine University, where she focused her thesis on pay equity in nonprofits. Sally's mission is to co-create workplaces where humans feel valued through living wages and healthy human connections. Her work at Loftis Partners emphasizes racial and pay equity, appreciative inquiry, and building on human strengths within organizations. Her commitment to ensuring people feel safe, seen, heard, and represented is evident in her multifaceted career. She's worked with over 50 organizations across 15 states and 3 continents, including Fortune 50 companies, small boutique businesses, and nonprofits of varying sizes. Her approach centers on creating lasting impact, leaving a collective of individuals capable of advancing this work independently. As Margaret Wheatley, one of my favorite authors, aptly stated, when we take a step or make a decision, we are tugging at webs of relationships that are seldom visible, but always present. Welcome, Sally. It is such a pleasure to have you. Before we dive into our topic today, would you be willing to share just a little bit about yourself personally so that our audience can get to know you as a whole human as well as an
Thank you,
expert?
Sarah. I appreciate it. And when I hear my bio, I'm always like, who is that person? And it's actually me. It's hard to believe sometimes the things you do. Just kind of an introduction to me and thinking about, I'm excited to be on a nonprofit leadership podcast. Nonprofits have been part of my life from the beginning. I had a mother who worked at a nonprofit school. I had caregivers who were very involved in nonprofits. So started volunteering in high school. So nonprofits have always been part of my life. And I started, kind of with a degree in human resources management because I loved working with people and love business. And so that has spanned over the last 30 years, which sounds way older than I feel. And that has looked at working in the corporate space, working as a consultant, working in nonprofits. Now, as having my own consulting business, I work with a lot of small to medium-sized businesses and a lot of nonprofits. So I am excited to talk about pay equity today because I'm actually about to release a book about implementing pay equity in nonprofits, specifically in U.S.-based nonprofits. So quite the relevant topic.
Excellent. Well, let's start with the basic question because I don't ever want to leave anybody behind in information. What is pay equity?
Yes, and I appreciate that you're starting there because it is a really important question. Pay equity is a term that we hear a lot these days. May hear, pay parity, pay transparency, cost of living, things like that. I really approach pay equity as an umbrella term, meaning that there are a lot of elements under that umbrella of pay equity, right? All the things I just talked about, pay transparency, parity, equal pay, how people are able to increase their pay in organizations. So it's a pretty broad topic, but it's really giving people resources to be paid thriving wages and to have pathways, to growth, despite kind of what their backgrounds are and realizing there are different, everybody kind of needs a different pathway. Like one size doesn't fit all anymore.
Yeah. So let's dive into a little farther into this pay equity umbrella. And what are kind of the issues that have been affecting everybody? And if you can highlight especially the ones, if if at all, that are different for nonprofits or where the nonprofit industry skews differently or the same? It's totally fair to be like, oh, this just affects every business, nonprofit or for profit. So just tell us, like, what are these things that we need to be watching out
Yeah,
for?
that's a great question. And to your point, it does go across business lines, right? But let's talk specifically about nonprofits. Right now, we're dealing with a workforce shortage, right? There's been a lot of kind of turnover in the field. I see a lot of nonprofits who have 40-50% turnover right now, or sit there and have jobs open for 6 to 12 months, which means that clients aren't getting served, right? Or there's pause in services. So there is a direct kind of community impact when that happens. And if you look at the research, most people are looking for stronger pay and benefits. And specifically, that's kind of, really become the priority in the last 5 years with the rising cost of living. And what has happened is that nonprofits are competing more often with for-profit entities and government agencies and things like that. And they just are really kind of on the bottom of the competitive talent marketplace because they aren't able to provide pay in the same ways that those entities can.
Yeah. And I was just on a panel talking about building your dream team for nonprofits. And this question came up, how do you retain staff? I mean, the number one answer from all of us panelists was pay people more.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad to hear you say, people are looking for that. And the nonprofit industry traditionally has been underpaying people incredibly. So, and then specifically, are there pay? I know we must know this, but I'd love to hear from you. We know there are pay equity issues along racial lines, along gender lines, along ability lines. What do you see are like the areas that nonprofits should be looking out for, and how do they begin to address those?
Yeah, that's a great point too, Sarah, around, there's a lot of different kind of specific issues around demographic identities, right? And we could kind of go down a rabbit hole for each of these, but I'll highlight 3 for you just to kind of, because there's more information in this space than some of the others. One is, we know there's a documented gender wage gap, right? And there's been a lot more, I will say, there's a lot more research around women, less around other genders. But around women specifically, that there's a huge pay gap, across the board. It's about 16%. One thing is that people, I used to assume, well, people just pay women less, like intentionally, but a lot of it's unconsciously because of the way we've structured our job descriptions or what our assumptions are about the types of people who will be successful in that role. Then whenever you look at race and ethnicity, again, documented gaps, and you start getting into intersectional identities. For instance, women of color are going to be paid significantly less than white women. And then, another piece that's not necessarily a gap, but it's around inclusive practices and really speaks to the nonprofit workforce shortage is around caregiving. Is that caregivers are really, with the increased cost for care, maybe decreased investment in healthcare coverage, from businesses, things like that, the need for more flexible schedules, things like that. They're really feeling the brunt of this as well.
Yeah. So tell me, I want to go back to what you said, because people, they don't necessarily realize that. They think, oh yeah, we're fine. We're not doing that. But you, like you said, you may be doing it and not realizing it. So what does that look like a job description, or how do these things kind of sneak in to our organizations, even when we're fairly aware?
Yeah. I think just generally, let me say, I think every organization needs to go through kind of a retrospective process right now of what has changed in the last 5 years. And really update the assumptions, right? So being able to hire somebody with a master's and pay them $45,000 a year is not realistic anymore. There are some people who get away with it, right? And are able to do that. But so really looking at what is it we're assuming about people. So that's kind of, and really at the strategic level about our talent. And trying to match that with what research is saying, because the workforce has changed, right? The workplace has changed and employees have changed. So that's the piece. I think, so the example you talked about, the job description, right, is really going back and saying, for
Yeah.
instance, we'll use the education example. Does somebody really need to have a master's, right, in this particular area? And what is it we're asking them to bring with that master's? Is it a certain level of knowledge? Is it a skill set? Are people able to access that same level of knowledge and skill set in other ways? Right? So I think it's really trying to have the conversations of what are we expecting and opening up our perspectives on this is kind of the singular track to this position versus there are people who come from different sectors, different kinds of jobs that can actually transfer those skills over that may not have our traditional requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think of like you might have an entrepreneur who's used to getting VC venture capital, investments. They'd probably make a great major gifts officer because they know how to build those relationships and have those meetings. But do they have any nonprofit experience? Maybe not, right? Any fundraising experience? Maybe not. But the core ability to communicate and network and build relationships would be there. What about job titles? 'Cause I'm thinking about, in my work, I work mostly with executive directors, but I'm always pushing for that job title to be
Right.
CEO because I really believe that the words we use affect the way we then think about things. Like that quote from Margaret Wheatley that you share, like we make leadership decisions and we have these rippling effects. There's always, if you have to plan on unintended consequences, and I think it matters. So do you see gender or racial lines at which we're using different job titles or job descriptions for things
Yeah, I
like
mean,
that?
there's definitely some research around like how we, the language you use in job descriptions and, may appeal to different demographics. Um, I will say kind of the bigger piece in that is that, one thing that, nonprofits can get stuck in sometimes, right, is being like, well, I'll never be able to pay like a venture capitalist, like you just gave the example. And you're right.
Mm-hmm.
And there it's a both and situation of yes, you can push your funders, right, your donors to really think about this as a social justice issue if they're into that, or a performance issue for your organization. And kind of the other piece of that is that what is it you can offer that maybe for-profit places can't? Can you offer flexibility? You can offer connection to a
Yeah.
mission. Right? You can offer, what I mean, like there can
Yeah.
be some other things that you can offer and package into kind of a total, offering to a candidate that does make it appealing that isn't always based on this person's got to make X amount of money. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, no, that makes so much sense. And I think, for those of you listening out there, the nature of the nonprofit business model means you're probably always going to have less dollars per person because you've got volunteers and because you have a mission that is probably not highly profitable to achieve. If it was, you'd be a for-profit, or may not be profitable at all to achieve your mission. Hence, you need to do fundraising. With all that being said, just like, Sally's saying, like it's a and issue, and you can be investing more in your fundraising capabilities, raising more, communicating better. I have yet to meet the person who you couldn't explain to them why underpaying and starving nonprofits of money damages their ability to make an impact. Like if you can have that conversation and it really works, like people get it, but they just don't start out knowing. So you have to educate them, and you can have a lot more money and you can pay people significantly more than you probably are
Well, and
paying
let me go
now.
back to kind of the title thing too. One thing that nonprofits also be open, right, to what your employees need. So a lot of times nonprofits, especially small to medium sized, are pretty flat organizationally. So, people feel like there's,
Mhm.
limited advancement, right? But you can, maybe look at, especially kind of as you establish like a pay grid which I do with a lot of clients, and look at kind of how people progress through salary bands, is you can add like a senior coordinator or a senior manager that shows progression for them if they stay at the organization that could benefit them if they leave your organization, right? So even thinking about that,
Yeah,
it
absolutely.
doesn't necessarily cost more to add a senior, right, on there, but it's an investment in the staff that they're going to appreciate.
I love that. I love that. You mentioned a pay grid, and that reminded me, I wanted to ask you about, you had mentioned under this umbrella of pay equity, pay transparency. And as a fan of open book management, I'm all over that. So tell us more about what is pay transparency and how do you go about
Yeah,
it?
pay transparency is kind of getting a little bit of a bad name these days, but let's talk about it. I'm a fan of it. Pay transparency is typically driven by laws that are passed in states and municipalities. I will say all of them are different in how you comply with those laws. So there's a level of legal compliance. It's typically around what you share when you're posting an open job. So if you have an opening, it's, you've got to post some kind of range in there. Depending on the law, you might have flexibility in what that range is, how much of the range you share. So that's kind of what it is. What I will go and tell clients is that that's the bare minimum around pay transparency is being legally compliant. But to do it well and to build trust in your organization, it's important that whenever you are legally compliant, that it's not the first time your current employees are seeing that information. Because, at least having
Yeah.
general bands and pay ranges in those bands gives people an idea of what they're working with versus they're going online and seeing, oh my goodness, somebody working in this program manager role is actually going to make more money than me. And I'm in the program manager role. And why am I not? It just creates such a huge collective disturbance in the organization that if people will step back and be a little more strategic about it, pay transparency can become a trust building action and a series of trust building actions that actually drive more employee engagement.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because I think I'm just guessing here, but that the reason why transparency initiatives in general struggle, whether it's around pay or other things, is how it's rolled out. Because we're adding a bunch of information, and when we're in transition, who gets the information first, how quickly the information is distributed, who ends up getting the information affects, because we need time to transition to it. And sometimes we get taken information and we're like, oh, I understand it. And that's learning, and you can adapt and turn it into action. And sometimes we get new information and we realize just how much we didn't know. And we're like, now I'm really confused. I thought I knew it and now I don't. And now there are problems. So we have to be aware that just transparency is not the whole picture. There's a whole process to becoming transparent. I've read about, mature organizations who went full on open book management, meaning it's not just pay transparency. Everybody can see every expense line item and everybody's paycheck. And the end result of the transition is everybody is being paid a fair amount for what they're bringing to the table, and everyone else feels great about what everyone's getting paid. But the transition process is you may have some people, right, who are getting paid more than they should be, and some people who are getting paid less than they should be. And you're going to have to go through that transition yourself probably before you just start airing your laundry in public, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a level of a lot of times people think transparency is legal compliance or like what you said, full transparency, right? Everybody knows what everybody makes. I'm not necessarily in the boat of that only because I don't know that it's scalable. And I think there are some protections around employees that need to be there, but transparency is more than just posting a range, right? Sometimes I work with organizations and supervisors don't have access to their team's pay data, or they're not educated in understanding how pay is calculated. So, those are levels of
Yeah.
transparency and work that actually build autonomy. and equip managers well
Yeah.
for conversations that are happening. That isn't always talked about necessarily in pay transparency, but those are kind of the cultural shifts that need to happen in that implementation.
I love that detail. We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor, but when we come back, we're going to dive into like how do you achieve this? What are the steps to that? Today's episode is being brought to you by Pivot Ground, which I created to assist people like you, executive directors, CEOs, board members, and other nonprofit leaders. I want to help you unleash your full potential to advance the missions that I know you care about so deeply. I know I've succeeded when achieving your mission is your greatest challenge and not a challenge around fundraising, leadership, or management. I've been an executive director, a board member, a secret toilet fixer, and now I'm a consultant and coach to nonprofits. And I'm here to support you with information, inspiration, and encouragement to help you make the greatest impact possible. To help you do that, my gift for you today is a newsletter where you can get bite-sized weekly tips for running your nonprofit. And you can access it at pivotground.com/sign up. A link will also be in the show notes. All right, let's get back to our conversation with Sally. We're talking about pay equity. So what are the steps for implementing pay equity?
Yes, this is, and I will say, I'm going to give you 4 phases, and I want to, before I go into those 4 phases, tell you a couple of things. One is that pay equity takes longer. Implementing pay equity takes longer than you think it's going to, because it's going to include a series of conversations and updating assumptions like we talked about a little bit earlier. There's going to need to be a conversation about what do we believe about pay? What do we believe about our people? What do we believe about the connection between those? Things like that. So the other thing is that I really encourage people to approach this with a sense of curiosity and not judgment. To what you said earlier about there's going to be times when you find out people are paid more than they should be. I never advocate for decreasing. But I'm saying that we all inherit situations, right, that we didn't manage, or maybe we made a mistake, whatever. It just is.
Yeah.
That's reality. Don't get caught in the guilt or the, whatever. Get caught up in the action, right? And then the third thing I'll say before the phases is that this process starts and ends with employees. And if you're not including employee voice throughout this, it's going to fail miserably. And so kind of the 4 phase.
I love that. It's almost like this is an extension of having your employees, be more connected to your organization. It's like one of those processes you should go through. Because at the end of the day, right, we're not just having pay equity because it's the right thing to do. It's also good for your organization.
Yeah,
right?
and I liken pay equity to kind of like a tightly woven sweater, that when you start pulling the right thread, things start falling out. So you start having conversations about, why is this person making so much more? Why did we make that decision then? And do we need to change that process? Or do we need to, sometimes we'll find in the assessment phase that there's salary compression. So let's talk about what is happening there. So that's why it kind of takes longer, is kind of untangling, some of that sweater. But really the first phase is preparation. And that's really just starting to kind of assessing your landscape, right? What is it What are employees saying? Do you have any employee feedback? Some organizations I work with have no employee feedback loops, and that's where we start, right? What's the cost of living?
Yeah.
In the areas where your employees are working? Are there great variances? So that's kind of the preparation and starting to kind of figure out like, what's the work we need to do? And sometimes it's, a lot of times people in smaller nonprofits who are leading this work are like the operations director or the executive director. And so this is one component, right?
Sure.
So it may be being like, hey, we need to bring on, a consultant to help us, or we need something like that. The second phase is actually doing that assessment.
Yeah.
Is, really looking at, I have instructions for how to complete your own pay equity assessment for free. And it's really about looking at your pay data. Again, sometimes people don't have access to all the pay data. right? Or don't have, a lot of times it's looking at demographic identities and maybe they don't have access to that. So that may be the starting space. Before I go to the next two phases, I want to stop there and see if you had any questions.
Yeah. So I have two questions. So one is, we'll start like internal and external are my questions. So when we're looking at external, like you mentioned cost of living, is there like a cost of living benchmark that you particularly like or any that you don't like? Tell me a little more about that, what you like to look for.
Very insightful question. Absolutely. I will say kind of the couple of places that most people will go are the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I'm going to talk about here in the United States. Bureau of Labor Statistics, their consumer expenditure survey. That's where I tend to get the information because now it is across all households, right? From anywhere from a single person with no debt to, two people not working with 6 kids in the house. So it is across. But I feel like it gives kind of a truer picture on expenses. Another place people will look is the MIT Living Wage Calculator. And that is going to give a much more kind of targeted pay range in that you can look at it for, of one person in a household, 2 people in a household with 3 dependents, things like that. I would encourage you, if you're going to use that, to pick the lane, of those options and stick with it across the board rather than being person specific. That gets you into kind of, I think, some discrimination issues, but pick which one you're going to use and use it across the board. But those are the 2 places that I go. I really tend towards the Bureau of Labor Statistics to give me an idea because it's a lot more, like I said, it tends to track with kind of the information I see.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I asked that question because in my younger years, having spent a lot of time abroad, I noticed that there are indicators that make more sense in some countries than others. So I spent some time in East Africa, and now I have some people who work for me in East Africa. And having been there, I know that like housing costs, not a great indicator because people often live with extended families and, what somebody needs to have a good living situation can vary a lot. And so I actually often for that part of the world, I look at the cost of a beer
Oh, I love that.
because
Yeah.
at a restaurant, because I know that culturally it's a very common practice to go out for a beer after work. And so somebody's like, what that takes compared to where I am. And here I'm comparing, what should I pay, so that I'm paying a good wage. And so it just caused me to think a little more deeply, but these things are connected, right? It's that thread is all connected when we think about that
Absolutely.
data.
I appreciate that you bring that up because I've worked with several kind of global healthcare nonprofits that do work in Africa, right? And they have workforces in Europe and Africa. And so, yes, gosh, the cost of living conversation is very different across the globe than it is specifically within the United States.
Yeah.
Even though within the United States, depending on where you live, it's very different. So, yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
For instance, in the United States, I live in North Carolina. Kind of average cost of living is about $60,000 to $63,000 a year. The national average is about $73,000 a year. But if you live in like Seattle, it's like $99,000 per year, right? Or New York or Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
So that's one of those kind of strategic conversations that you've got to have if you have people who live in different places, because you're having to, at a nonprofit, you're having to figure out are we going to pay by location? Are we going to have kind of a nationwide pay scale? What are we going to do about that? And that's not usually a one and done conversation I've found. People have a lot of opinions and have to kind of work through that. So that's a great example of like having to really put some strategy and intention behind it because people are going to ask why you made that decision.
Absolutely. And we're in that world now, right? We're not in a world where everyone, you are highly likely as an organization, if you don't already have a remote employee, you are highly likely to have that. And once you have that, crossing state borders or even, continents, countries, is real even for very small organizations. So my other question was about internally, right? So you mentioned, people might not have that pay data. Can you just give us a quick bullet list? What is that data? So those folks out there who are asking do I have it or not can quickly answer
Yeah,
if they have
absolutely.
it or
Typically
not.
in the pay equity assessment that I do, and there's certainly a lot of models out there, but the one that I use really starts to drive to looking at the data across different demographic identities. So we're looking at, if you even have salary bands, right? So, what's going on within each salary band? Looking at age, gender, race and ethnicity, looking at tenure, right? And we look at that because sometimes the longer people stay, the less likely they are to get increases. So we look at kind of the highest paid and the lowest paid. What's the ratio between there? There's certainly more you could add, but that's where we start because you start seeing as you look at that data. I have found sometimes when you're inputting that data, you're like, oh, this one person keeps coming up. What's going on there? Again, that curiosity, not judgment. So that's some of the data that we pull.
Got it. Great. Okay. So tell us the rest of the
the other
phases.
couple of phases are leadership buy-in and implementation. So leadership buy-in actually really starts in the preparation phase, but it's really trying to get through. A lot of times, you're looking at decision makers around the budget, right? You're looking at sometimes it's, I've done this when I've worked as a nonprofit HR manager. It took us 3 years to implement the pay equity because we just didn't have the budget, right? In the beginning. So there's a lot of pieces of that where you're probably having to forecast and, it may be the board of directors is having to approve stuff, committees, things like that. The other piece is actually the implementation. So once you kind of get what you want to do is implementing that work and then communicating it. Ideally, your supervisors are going to be having those conversations. So there's going to be a level of sorry, I don't know if there's some beeping out there.
Sorry.
I will say, there's going to be a level of equipping your supervisors with the information they need to have those conversations. So, I apologize. Hopefully you can edit that out. But there's going to be a level of information that you need to give to your supervisors. Most of us are not trained in compensation, right? Even if I have an HR degree and there was very little about compensation. So assume this is an ongoing conversation and education process. So your supervisors are going to,
I just want to highlight that for a second, right? Because you said earlier, right? What does it even mean for someone to have a degree, right? Because we might be like, oh, someone, so, and you've just said you have an HR degree and you aren't even trained in compensation. So, that's an assumption that probably a lot of people are making. So I just want to highlight, those, we have to watch out for those assumptions.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that because it is. And, this is going to be the supervisor is going to be the person who typically the employee is going to come to first. So you want to equip them and educate them on that. And that's capacity building for your supervisors. They're going to be a better supervisor because they know that. Then there's going to be the element of communicating it to employees, right? And that's going to take place over time. Typically, there's a series of, all staff meetings, one-on-one conversations, things like that to what, there may be pay changes that are happening, things like that. And then kind of the final piece of implementation is going to go back and be measuring your success. So, doing your pay equity assessment 6 to 12 months later and being like, have we made progress? And then, maybe you came in because you had high turnover, going back and looking at those turnover metrics. Implementation is a big piece, right? And that's why it takes longer than expected because you have all these conversations. And if you're going to do it well, everybody's going to be bought in.
Love it. I know we're pretty much at time, but I have a burning question because you mentioned, a theme is this, this is a problem to solve slowly, which is true of most people challenges. But let's say you can't, you identify that you need to be paying certain people more, but you don't have the budget yet. How in your implementation process do you communicate that and handle that?
I so appreciate that you asked this question because I get asked it a lot. And I will say one is, when you're doing your assessment, I don't necessarily encourage clients to go out and communicate all the results without actions. So you may have to sit with that information for a little while before you can do anything about it. And that's not hiding it from your employees. It's just you're trying to figure out what you're going to do, and you want to communicate that whenever you're, doing implementation, because that's a level of transparency. I think the other thing is that what can you do? Can you bring these wages up a little bit? Can you go out to a funder and ask for more money? Take as many steps as you can. They may need to be micro steps. Also tell people, there are some costs that we don't necessarily keep up with. For instance, turnover cost. When you think about a position turning over, it's probably going to be 3 to 6 months. That's a great estimate. It could take way longer, but to get a person into that position and fully operating into a new position, right? You're absorbing that cost, right? You're like, okay, great. I have saved money on salary and benefits in that, but you're absorbing the cost of somebody else probably taking on that work, lost efficiency in the team. So if you go back and kind of calculate that 6 months of lost work compared to what it would take to have maybe bumped that person up, it's actually gonna maybe save you money. Or if the person stays longer, obviously long term, you're gonna perform better. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. It does make sense. And I'm making a note to do, because we have a way, my clients who I teach the impact method, that they can actually track those costs, which are tricky to track, because we basically are able to categorize all of our work. One of the categories is optimum speed and capacity. And another one that gets affected is having a happy, effective team. And what you see is, because we track all the projects and time in that way, you'll see, like, if they're a development hire or a program hire, you'll see the hours shift from program or development or wherever they're working to happy, healthy team or optimum speed and capacity as they're having these onboarding meetings and learning and training. And you'll actually be able to see shift in hours for bringing them on. This has been so helpful. I could just ask you questions all day long, but we're going to wrap it up here. Because pay equity touches on that really critical element of having what I like to call a happy, healthy, effective team. And that is, you could say money is the fuel, but I feel like, the people are really the power behind what runs our organization. So it's such an important topic. For people who have bought in, they're like, yes, I want pay equity. I'm ready to get started. It feels like it's possible. What words of wisdom would you give them, and how can they reach out to you if they would like help from you?
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that. And yes, I could talk about this all day. It's my passion. I will say another kind of piece of advice is be in community when you're doing pay equity implementation. It's really important to have some people that you can call up and be like, hey, what do y'all do about negotiations? Or have y'all altered your promotion process because of this? I do offer a free version of a community. It's called the Pay Equity Collective. There are paid versions, but there is a free one on my website where you can go and access some of the resources I talked about today. You just have to sign up. Also have a new book coming out in
Great. We'll have those links in the show notes.
Summer 2024, the Pay Equity Guide for Nonprofits. That's going to be coming out. And then, of course, you can find me on my website, loftispartners.com. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. Find me there. Happy to have, a quick conversation with you about your needs and kind of as far as you can go in this process. I don't assume that all of my, clients can go all the way, but I'm happy to coach you along that process.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Sally. We'll have Sally's contact info and links in the show notes. It has been such a pleasure to have you. And thank you out there for listening, but also for all that you do to make our communities better. Take care of yourself, take care of your team, take time for self-care, and be sure to subscribe and listen to the next episode of Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Until then, all the best.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.